Good day, and welcome to another one of Randsource weekly wraps. As usual, we'll cover three topics of the last week, and then it's going to be a new tradition. We're doing a little AI wrap at the end. Okay, starting with the three topics, they're going to be the US debt ceiling, Eskom, and finally, I just want to look at what's happening with us and Russia and the US and how big a threat that is actually to the South African economy. And of course, at the end, we'll do a little AI wrap, and I want to focus a little bit on Apple and some of the other things that are happening in the AI space at the moment. So, let's start off with the debt ceiling. So those that don't know, what happens is that the US has a kind of a limit to how much debt it can have. And to increase that limit, you need to basically, the different houses of the government, Congress mainly in this case, to basically get together and say, yes, the debt ceiling can be raised by a certain amount. The US can borrow enough money to pay its debts. Any economy, any large economy at the moment, it doesn't basically ever get flat in terms of how much money they owe. They never get to zero. What they do is they keep on borrowing and, borrowing because they usually spend more than they make. The justification for this is that the economy is growing every year. And if you're going to be fueling future growth, let's just say you basically are able to, borrow for $1 billion and get like 100 million in terms of benefits for 10, 20, 30 years. That's a positive thing because basically you're getting, more than you put into it effectively. And that is what government uses to justify this. Of course, over time, things like, social security and other entitlements have become more and more important. But, still that pattern remains. Governments borrow more than they basically spend more than they take in every year. And that difference has to be made up by borrowing. And, the economy grows by a certain percentage every year. And that usually gets into a nice little balance. Over the last couple of years, they've been out of whack. I mean, the US government and many other governments around the world have borrowed significantly more than they have historically. In South Africa, for instance, that COVID, grant, it still remains after COVID. In the US, the spending increases we saw, some of them are coming down, but some of them still remain. And there's new spending, of course, requirements, things like the Ukrainian, war, etc. So, the US government borrows more than it basically brings in every year. That means the amount of debt it has goes up every year. And that means this debt ceiling thing becomes a common, regular reoccurrence where the debt has to be raised regularly. And what this does is gives the party in power. As long as you don't have every single house, like the presidency, the Senate, the Congress controlled by a single party, the other party can basically play spoiler effectively with this thing. And what's happening here is the Republicans are playing spoiler the Congress, and that's what's happening with regards to the debt ceiling at the moment. They are asking for significant spending cuts in order to basically allow for a raising of the debt ceiling. Now, it always gets like a little close to the line, every single time closer and closer to the line. But you must understand, nobody, not the Republicans, not the Democrats, nobody wants to have the US not raise the debt ceiling because that means the US goes into default. When the risk-free rate of a world or planet like Earth goes into default, and obviously I don't have examples of other planets, but when the world's risk-free rate goes into default, what happens is that it just disrupts all the financial markets. It just has a huge ripple effect. It's a gigantic, thing if it does happen. And no one wants to have that happen. The US benefits tremendously by having the US dollar as being the world's reserve currency. Effectively, everybody in the world outside the US that has US dollars is effectively lending that amount of money to the US government. Okay, that's what they are doing. And if you think of how the hundreds of billions of US dollars in reserves in China and India and around the world in people's vaults and people's bank accounts and so on, that's all loans to the US government. So it benefits hugely from having the reserve currency of the world. Doesn't want to spoil that. But, each party, each time that's, out of power wants to get a bit more and wants to push a closer line to say, oh, we are really serious this time. And that gives them more leverage to get what they want. So they can extract concessions from the party in power. And the Democrats basically are in power, the Republicans are out of power, and the Republicans want to have more spending cuts, etc. go through because they, philosophically at least say that they're the party of lowest spending. But really they're the party of lowest spending when they're not in power. Okay, that's just the thing. So debt ceiling, almost certainly going to go and be solved. But if it isn't, it's a catastrophic event, okay? Just understand it's a catastrophic event if it's not solved. But I would say that it almost certainly will be solved. So that's the debt ceiling. The next thing we're going to talk about is Eskom. A couple of things have happened in that front in the last couple of weeks, or last week or so. Firstly, it's been becoming pretty clear that we're going to have level 8 this winter. Eskom's basically said not getting to level 8 would be a win for them, and so, maybe they're sitting the bar very, very low and they're going to try and pass it. But many analysts out there say if it's a bad winter, we're going to get to level 8. It's a very high likelihood of that happening. The new schedule came out. It went up to level 16. I don't even know what that means, quite frankly. We're close to approaching 20 hours. You might have 4 or 6 hours of power in a day. That at that level, understand what breaks down. The mobile networks don't work properly at that level. 16, the mobile networks will not work properly. The basic underlying infrastructure of the internet might not work properly. You'd have trouble at the banks. You'd have trouble with the supermarkets. You'd have trouble basically even getting things like petrol in, because all these things work off electricity in some way or the other. So if you get to like level 16, it can't last very long before the whole system is under pressure. And then we might have that grid collapse like we talked about many times before. That's one thing. The other thing is Andy de Ruyter, the former head of Eskom, has come out with a tell-all book. And I don't know if this was something he planned in advance. It's for money. I don't think it is for money, quite frankly. Books are not that huge money spinners nowadays. But it is something I think that he can use to, redefine his legacy and give his side of the story out there. That's usually what books are for people like this. And look, we have Malula come out and say that, load shedding will be ended by this year, guaranteed. Well, take that with a pinch of salt is all I say. Take that with a very spadeful of salt if you think about it. So load shedding is becoming a big problem, more likely to be a bigger problem over the winter, as basically people need to actually heat their homes if it's a cold winter. And like I said, there's talk of level 16, which is, like I said, ridiculous. The country could not survive on level 16. Level 8 is, viable, because, if you have your 4-hour periods where you can recharge your batteries and recharge those kind of things, usually you can recover. You know what I mean? So if you have a system that, 4 hours of power, 4 hours of power, usually there's batteries and inverters and that kind of stuff that can bridge you to that thing. If you have maybe 4 to 6 hours of power in a day, not going to be possible. You don't have enough batteries in the country to do that kind of stuff. And like I said, major backbone infrastructure in this country will cease to function. If that happens, the mobile phones will cease to function because the towers won't work. So the routers and the underlying fiber infrastructure stuff may not function, because they may not have power to run them through those long periods of load shedding. That's an important factor to keep in mind. And finally, in terms of the news of the week, we're going to talk about Russia. Now, of course, we've had the round weakened dramatically, and we've all seen that happen. 1950 has been almost touched. Some developments since last week we spoke. The U.S. ambassador has come out, kind of semi-apologized for the way he's basically talked about, this thing. He apologized for the way he said things. He didn't apologize, by the way, for what he said. And what he said was that the South Africans were supplying, the South government, or South Africa in some way was supplying, some kind of military aid to the Russians. That's totally illegal according to international law, because of the things we have signed on to, etc. We should not be doing that. If we are, we're going to be facing sanctions from places like the US and Europe and so on. And if you think about just what the US and Europe mean in the global financial system, but they are the global financial system that we operate in. Yes, China is a huge economy. Yes, places like India have huge populations and are growing economies. But if you look at the entire global system, it's basically the US-European system that everybody works off. SWIFT and doing transfers and all those kind of things work off the US-European system. If we get cut off from that there, we are not China, we are not Russia. We can't basically, even Russia couldn't do it. Russia is not able to basically function properly now after being cut off. So yeah, that is the one thing that I'd be very fearful about. The question then arose is, what would happen, and would it likely happen, that we'd be sanctioned? Now, here's the case for why we will not be sanctioned. South Africa has a lot of friends internationally. It'll be quite a drastic step to alienate a country like South Africa for a minor deal like this here. South Africa is kind of still fence sitting in terms of the whole the war. Though they are supporting the Russians, they haven't they aren't like Belarus or something. You know what I mean? So yeah, we are to a certain extent still kind of gray enough that we might get away with things, and that's why the US might not do it. Why the US might do it is, number one, we are very unimportant. Politically, we don't have a real base in the US that supports us. I joked today that, South Africans living in the US are not like Israelis living in the US. They don't have a lobby of South Africans trying to support South Africa in the US. Generally, the kind of vibe I get from South Africans that live in places like Australia and the US, they don't really want to support the South African government. They're quite anti-South African government at the very least. And that's number one. Number two, economically, we're a mighty trading partner for like the Europeans and the Americans. Yeah, they can easily cut us off. Not as easy to cut off the Chinese, by the way. They're much more, embedded in the US system or the global system. The Indians, not as well as the Chinese, but much bigger than us, much more important than us. Brazil also much more important than us. So if they want to try and hit the BRICS outside Russia, South Africa is the easy target. Politically, no power, like I said. Economically, very little economic, impact on them. And militarily, we don't really play a part. The Chinese obviously are the only thing happening there, but the Indians are supported by the Americans because they don't want to alienate the Indians because they want the bulwarks, kind of like the Americans have built kind of a encirclement of the Chinese. They've got places like the Philippines, places like Taiwan, places like Japan, and India is an important part of that encirclement of the Chinese to prevent them from projecting the power. What the Americans don't want to do is have the Chinese have secure borders because that allows them to project their power globally. That's why the Americans, by the way, have all these bases around the world because they don't really need to protect their home because they are so secure, at home. There's nobody in the Western Hemisphere that messes with them, so they are pretty much secure. The Chinese have the Indians on their border. They have the Japanese virtually on their border. They have the South Koreans on their border. They have the Taiwanese on their border. They have the Russians on the other side, even though the Russians are a bit more friendly at the moment. But they have to protect themselves internally before they can even think of projecting themselves to larger, grounds out there. So India's not going to be messed around with. The Brazilians, Western Hemisphere, biggest country in South America. You can't really, it's going to be a major strategic blunder for the US to ever try to alienate the Brazilians because suddenly they become close to the Chinese, and suddenly the Chinese now do have a base in the Western Hemisphere, in a very populous, very powerful country. Cuts the whole of South America effectively off from the Americans. Not going to mess around with that. What's left? South Africa. What does South Africa have around it? Zimbabwe and Namibia, and who cares? Okay, what does South Africa do economically? Nothing. Even the African continent is a small player economically. South Africa is not the biggest player anymore by some measures in the African continent. So yeah, that's one of the dangers. If we are cut off, huge impact on us. As South Africans, much more difficult to do international business, even beyond what the rule of this cutoff would be. Like, for instance, they might put sanctions in South Africa, but might technically be allowable for South Africans to put money overseas and translate and transfer money, etc. But we've already seen from what happened in Russia that when there are sanctions in certain areas, companies don't want to go and pick out the little loopholes, that get them around certain kind of technicalities around these sanctions. They kind of just say, "Oh, sanctions avoid entirely." Because unless it's a huge opportunity, unless it's a huge loss for them, the hassle of actually doing this is too great for them to basically go off and, risk things. So yeah, that's number one. So South Africa, if it does get any kind of sanction, expect the impact to be even greater than what the outline or what the write-up of the sanction looks like. We'll have things coming into play that are beyond the scope of what the sanctions are going to be. And like I said, we probably are not going to have the kind of sanctions they have against the Russians, but anything is going to, have that ongoing impact. And finally, let's talk about AI at the moment. A couple of big things happen in AI. Firstly, we had Sam Altman, by the way, great name, Altman. He's the guy running AI. It's an interesting fact. Like we're saying, Bolt. The guy's runner is Bolt. It's an interesting fact that some names are appearing at certain times. So yeah. Anyway, testified in front of Congress with a guy called Gary Marcus and someone from IBM, etc., about AI. Very important to have a look at what they talked about and, etc. Basically asking for more regulation, asking for more controls. OpenAI comes out and says that they're not going to be training the next version of GPT-5 for at least 6 months. And this kind of does indicate a bit of a slowdown. Remember the last version, GPT-4, was trained with data from September 2021 up to September 2021. So if they're talking 6 months here, they're talking a 2-year break between the first and the second, the first one ending and the second one starting to be trained. So I think that's a big kind of slowdown on that front. But at the same time, while, OpenAI may be slowing down, other players are entering this field at the moment. And as I've explained to you before, the AI development is not large language models. It's not, ChatGPT. It's not whatever. It's these big farms where you can put information in and get something out that basically, makes sense and does intelligent things. You put information about language, you get something that can speak language. You put in pictures in, you can get something that draw pictures. You put in protein models in, you get something that can basically figure out protein structures. Okay, this is what this thing does right now. This particular, technology. And Apple is looking to basically incorporate health into it. If you think about it, for those that have an Apple Watch, the amount of information Apple gets on you is gigantic. When you sleep, when you wake up, your heart rate, your blood pressure, certain watches do that here. It works out your constant heart rate. The EKG knows what your heartbeat is doing, how often you rest, how often you walk around, sit down, that kind of stuff. You combine it with a few more things, and suddenly you have a doctor that's beyond any doctor in the world right now, especially when you combine that with AI. Because no doctor in the world at the moment is taking a constant looking at your heart rate and monitoring every single day when you go to sleep and wake up, or is thinking every single time you sit down and get up again. Nobody, even the richest man in the world, is not affording that kind of stuff. But your Apple Watch does that for you. You combine that with technology that looks at that data, figures out what's happening with you. You could basically be spotting heart attacks weeks in advance. You could be spotting things like Alzheimer's, like Parkinson's, in terms of how you walk, that impacts, that can be interpreted to figure out that kind of stuff. All these factors will play a part in the AI that you get from Apple. By the way, that new AI is called Quartz. Apple's also obviously working with Siri and that kind of stuff. But I think this is like another frontier of AI. I've always thought that if you get the Apple Watch or the Google Watch or the Samsung Watch, whatever, to basically become your personal doctor, monitoring your GP basically. Obviously, you can't do like things like X-ray you or something, but can monitor your heart rate, can monitor your breathing, can monitor that kind of stuff. From the way you move and what the information you carry from your wrist. Those things are really, really valuable, because if you have a total readout of my heart rate over months and months and months, when it starts to change, there's something wrong with my heart. If you have a readout of my blood pressure over months and months and months, same thing. My blood pressure starts to change. It's a warning sign for things. So that can give you information that's beyond what you normally get from a GP. And let me say, go and talk to a doctor, go and see a specialist. And like I said, this would work. This would actually have real benefits. And when you have real benefits, people find out about it. And once you find out about it, and once you know that this thing is going to really help you out, who among us is not just going to spend a couple of $1,000 to buy a watch and hook up to the AI platform of our choice to make sure that we don't die of a heart attack or don't have a stroke without being basically warned in advance, or don't basically have early onset Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or who knows what else out there. So, like I said, huge new frontier. And I'd definitely pay more for, something like this here than I would, for instance, for just a large language model or a program that can draw stuff for me. It's a huge new source of income for Apple and for Google, whoever gets this else right. And Apple, like I said, is starting off with this. So, yeah. That's the wrap for this week. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to speaking to you guys again next week. Cheers.